normally when you go to like an exchange or something, they have whatever forms of their shares issued in some back office somewhere, however that may be, and they're essentially giving you derivatives of that share in their database, saying this is your account. This is what we owe you. That's really what they're saying. What we owe you, and they're essentially creating this means of showing that you have the right to own something through their traditional database systems. Where here we're just showing the exact same thing as a token on the blockchain. It's literally no different than a piece of paper or the data being in some database or being on the blockchain. It's just representing the right of the thing that you're trying to issue, sell, or engage. Right. So to get into it, one of the major reasons why I even host these spaces in the first place, and I've said this before on a previous space, but the biggest thing is I talk to a lot of people in the XDC community as well as the broader crypto space all the time, and I get asked all these questions, basically mostly around who's doing what and in what capacity are they doing that, can we work with them, and if we can work with them, how do we reach them, as well as get asked a ton of questions by the broader community on these same sort of things. What's going on? How are people able to build on the network? What are other people doing? How can I work with others and whatnot? And my biggest thing is it's easier to have one big space in a sort of a public forum to be able to have different projects interact with each other, have different people from the foundation interact with different projects, have people part of the community and have people part of the community be able to come up and ask questions, as well as people just having a general public forum to be a part of in terms of everything XDC. And I feel super honored to be able to sort of lead these things and be able to help people come together around it, because I think it's really cool, as well as I have a bunch of different things that I sort of am dabbling in that's really interesting to be able to speak about in these spaces, as well as be able to explore different ideas. So right now I'll say if anyone has any questions, anyone has any projects they want to share, or any ideas they want to expound upon, anything to do with XDC, don't hesitate to ask. We'll bring you right up. We'll be able to discuss those different topics and be able to get right into everything. One of the first things I'll start off with is some of the different things that I've been dabbling with. I try to do this at least every chat, just to give people a little update of what's going on, at least in my life. And yeah, one of the biggest things that I've sort of been dabbling in the past like week or two is thinking about what type of ways can I create template smart contracts to allow for other developers, but also people who aren't developers, to be able to build on the network a lot easier, as well as be able to have an understanding of what can be done on the network. And actually, one of my biggest things that I've been getting into is, of course, it's XDC, automated trade finance. And it's kind of funny, perfect timing actually, considering everything going on with like Silicon Valley Bank and all the banks freaking out and stuff and all that, because one of the main contracts that I've been focusing on for the past about 3 weeks now are how can we take certain trade finance concepts and allow them to be simplified, A, for other people to utilize, but B, for people to see how these concepts can be used on the networks. This includes futures contracts, forwards contracts, options contracts, different means of tokenizing derivatives, tokenizing commodities, and whatnot, even tokenizing data. And I've been putting together a few set of smart contracts that allow people to be able to A, have an understanding of how these things work, and B, be able to utilize these concepts on the network. Because what's the point of banking the unbanked if you're essentially not able to do the same things banks can do? That's sort of my philosophy on blockchain, is just because you hold a token in your account doesn't mean you're being your own bank. Being your own bank is being able to do everything the banks can do, but being able to do it yourself. And if you're able to exchange futures contracts, exchange options contracts, exchange commodities, be able to tokenize different goods, this is truly banking the unbanked. This is truly being your own bank. You don't necessarily have to go to a third party to be able to enact in these services. You can enact in these services in an autonomous manner, whether decentralized or essentially doing it yourself. And I think it's a really cool and interesting concept. So it's something that I've been putting together, and I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into this as we go throughout the space. But the general idea is, can we put together a set of template contracts that anyone here that doesn't know how to code can easily look at and go, wow, okay, this is how it works. Here's a diagram. Here's a little thing that explaining what it does, and even in the code comments explaining how these different contracts can be put together, as well as developers being able to see these contracts, integrate these contracts into their projects, and they can now start enacting on different services without essentially having to go through the upfront time and cost to be able to do it themselves. Not that they couldn't do it themselves, it'd just be a lot quicker to be able to take a library of code and be able to integrate it into your project, rather than essentially doing it all yourself every single time you want to do it. I'm trying to get my co-host up here, but Twitter's being a little weird. But yeah, no, that's basically what's going on in Quincy land for the past few weeks. And like I said, I'll go a little bit more into it as the space goes on, because it's something I'm actually I don't know if I would necessarily say super passionate about, because I don't know if I would say I'm passionate about finance in a sense, but essentially being able to make things easier for people is really cool for me, as well as essentially being able to utilize the same services individually rather than being an entire bank. I actually remember in college I did this project where we had to literally set up our own bank, and we found out all this stuff, you need $20 million of capital, you need all these different requirements just to do really basic things. And being able to do this yourself on the blockchain is, well, one, significantly easier, and you can essentially automate the entire process rather than having to go through all of these different means of essentially just creating a savings account, or essentially creating a means of people being able to exchange with each other. So sort of being in the position now where I can essentially build these automated tools to do that, especially even back then when I was like, oh my gosh, who would ever go through this, is kind of ironic for me, but it's pretty funny. Anywho, before I go on, does anyone have any questions on what I previously stated on top of banking yourself or being able to create your own trade finance services, and what that potentially means for different developers potentially wanting to utilize these packages, or just for people to have a broader understanding of how blockchain could operate? That's no problem. But yeah, one of the biggest things that, especially that I'm seeing in the space is, and I sort of want to sort of start off the space because I think this is really cool. But one of the biggest things that I'm seeing in the space is the ability to tokenize commodities. We always talk about currencies and stocks and assets and all these different things, but we don't really talk about commodities as much. And I've been sort of floating around the space a bit and seeing all the different means of being able to utilize these tools. And one thing that I end up seeing becoming a bigger and bigger thing is really actually kind of bigger in third world countries or even just smaller countries, is being able to utilize financial services via smartphone. These same financial services that you would otherwise use at the Chicago Commodities Exchange or any of these other exchanges, and being able for, whether it's farmers interacting with grocery stores, whether it be people that are miners interacting with the people that are able to acquire whatever resource that they're mining, and essentially being able to tokenize these commodities in such a manner in which they're able to utilize the financial services that they would normally have to go through a giant institution via just a smart contract. And it's very early on, it's sort of in the talks, but it's just really interesting to see where things are going, especially around the notion of tokenizing commodities. We typically think of blockchain as, like I said, being your own bank, but being able to source and trade something like a commodity in the form of an NFT or a token is really interesting, especially in economies that barely have running water, but they all have smartphones. It's really cool. And you don't have infrastructure like that, especially banks, exchanges, all this. It's really, really, really probably the most important that they're able to be able to automate these tools, because if they weren't, they would essentially need somebody, like I said, with $20 million to come in and create this giant infrastructure institution to be able to facilitate this, when now we can use smart contracts and facilitate it ourselves. Sort of like what I was saying before, banking the unbanked by being able to create financial services that otherwise would only be capable through these traditional finance institutions. And at least for me, I find it kind of the coolest thing ever, because I never knew that there were some of these farmers in these other countries that could very easily use a futures contract where they can agree on the price on something now and then essentially pay for it later, and they're able to interact with different grocery stores in which they're able to, and that's thing, it could be futures contract, forwards contract, whatever it may be. They can essentially negotiate with grocery stores to be able to pre-sell or agree to sell crops that haven't essentially fully matured yet, and have a stable means of revenue, as opposed to, the crops mature, they're trying to figure out a way to sell them really quickly, and obviously like these economies are able to find a way for this to work. But being able to bring these sophisticated trade finance instruments, especially just via the internet, via smart contracts, via not even the means of hosting them, you don't necessarily need to send up your own tech stack or your own tech infrastructure to be able to host these applications. They're able to very easily be able to participate in trade finance tools that we take for granted here, and they're actually able to do it cheaper than we are, because they don't have these brokers and all these different fees associated with it. And it's just really cool to see the development of that. And I see a lot in the crypto space of like, what does crypto adoption look like? And it's funny because everyone takes that assumption and goes, oh, that must mean people are going on Coinbase and buying more crypto. And in reality, what ends up happening is you end up seeing different tools utilized in smaller economies, and obviously growing in bigger economies, and they're able to sustain some level of economic growth solely based on the notion of utilizing these technologies to facilitate some form of trade. And this is really cool because you end up seeing people just use crypto just because they need to run their business more efficiently, and they sustain their business by being able to use this cheaper or more efficiently than they previously otherwise would. Or they don't have access to these other tools or these other exchanges or brokers or firms or whatever it may be, and they almost don't have any choice to. But what ends up happening is now that they have the ability to, they can essentially expand their economies the same way we are able to expand our economies. And it seems as if this is just as efficient as I hope it to be, you may end up seeing entirely new economies in different countries that we may not even take seriously, that may be able to expand faster than our own. Well, partially because they're small, so of course they're going to expand quickly. But they're going to be a lot more efficient because instead of having all of these third parties essentially trying to interact with each other, they're able to automate the entire task on a decentralized network and be able to sustain some level of economic growth doing so. It's actually, like, in my opinion, one of the most amazing things about crypto that sort of gets overlooked because everyone just assumes that adoption is just buying more tokens. But and I guess that is sort of happening when you see some of these people interact with these networks. But even then, what you end up seeing too is you'll end up seeing different, we can call them like liquidity providers, provide stable coins to these people too. So obviously, like, you have the volatility in the main crypto token, but being able to provide stable coins in some of these smaller economies in which some people don't even have a bank account, they literally don't have a bank account. They're these cash economies that barely have running water, don't have a bank account, but everybody has a smartphone, and you're able to essentially issue this means of capital in order for them to be able to engage with each other quite easily without them having a bank account, literally banking the unbanked. I think it's the coolest thing. Another thing I might go into in just a moment is talking about how uh, dApps can sort of operate differently than traditional Web3 applications. Ooh, I see a question. Mr. XRP, let me bring you up here. Hey, Mr. XRP, how you doing?
Doing well, Quincy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you
you
sound a
sound a
little
little
muffled,
muffled,
but
but
I
I
think we
think
can
we can
make
make
you
you
out.
out.
Sorry, I'm just at work and just on the hands free. So I just wanted to jump in and just say thanks for the space because I was having the conversation with a few friends yesterday, actually, um, Bitcoin maxis, of course, and just sort of giving them the breakdown of my understanding of blockchain, how crypto works. And this is exactly what his question to me was, is how do all these commodities and assets become, live on the blockchain? And then, as you can tell by my name, I'm sort of talking about how they'll interact with XRP, XRPL, and how they'll transfer across the world. But it's just I didn't have a clear understanding of what you're about to dive into and teach us all about how these commodities and assets actually get, put on blockchain via smart contracts and then can operate with these ledgers with the liquidity pools and whatnot.
Yeah. Actually, I'm glad you said that, because a lot of this comes down to what do these traditional finance instruments mean, and then what do they mean in this environment being on the blockchain. And really, when you look at a commodity, if you go to a commodities exchange or wherever, whatever you're buying is a promise to the actual asset or the actual commodity. So it's no different than me writing on a piece of paper, I have, 10,000 pounds of rice. Would you like to buy this right to own the rice? And I mean, you can get more sophisticated with options and futures and future delivery and all of that. But essentially, it's just a right to ownership to the commodity, and then there's a level of collecting that ownership based off of you having the right to it. And that's really all it is. So if I was to tokenize a commodity, I'm essentially creating a token that represents the right to the commodity, and I'm essentially selling that right in a multitude of different ways. I can sell it directly, like, oh, here you go. Someone like let's say for instance I wanted to sell like I said 10,000 pounds of rice or whatever, and I want to sell it directly to a grocery store. Well, me just doing the sale with them could be through the token, but that token means they have the right to the commodities that I'm currently possessing. And obviously there would need to be a means of delivery, and there would actually be it's funny that you say that. There's actually a bit more complexity in terms of how you maintain that delivery and maintain that assurance and there's a way that we can go about this in the blockchain world. But the biggest point of it is you're selling the right to an asset or selling a right to a commodity, and that person now owns that right in which they can now collect on it. And like I said, you can do it in a more sophisticated means in terms of forwards, options, futures, and all these different finance instruments. But at the end of the day, you're selling a right to something. So after they buy it, and let's say they bought it directly, they now own those commodities, and obviously they'd want to come collect it. But that's ideally what you're selling. You're selling a right. No different than me having a piece of paper, some contract saying, if you buy this many barrels of whatever, you own it. And obviously, like, there's a bit more complexity in that in terms of being able to collect and the fees associated with it. But the main point is you're selling a right to something, and you're able to do that programmatically. And presuming all the parties come together and act fairly, you're able to increase your economic engagement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a beautiful breakdown, and it just really explains to me, from the base layer, how these guys or, the unbankable do get on this. And yeah, now I have a bit of a better understanding of how, so and so can get their rice, on the blockchain, tokenized, and yeah, the unbankable can participate in this ecosystem. Thank you.
No, I'm so glad you brought that up because it seems a little bit confusing on what the notion of tokenize means. And what I like to say is when you buy a stock, actually, it's funny. I actually created a startup a few years ago and created a little company on LegalZoom. And they literally send you this little packet. And in the packet, you get like maybe I think it's like 1,000 of these little pieces of paper, and it's like shares of your company that you just incorporated. But that's literally it. It's these pieces of paper that essentially represent portions of your company. Now these can be represented in a more sophisticated way in the form of a series of contracts, a form in digitally, whatever it may be. But the right to whether it's a share to a company, a commodity, whatever it may be, is no different as a piece of paper than it is as a token on the blockchain. Except instead of the information being on that piece of paper and instead of it being stamped with whatever official stamp that has on it, that data is on the blockchain, and that stamp is essentially the token itself. And when I go and sell a share or sell a commodity or whatever, it's no different than the piece of paper. I'm just doing it digitally. It's actually, I would even say it's a bit more simpler than how they traditionally do it digitally. Because now, normally, when you go to like an exchange or something, they have whatever forms of their shares issued in some back office somewhere, however that may be, and they're essentially giving you derivatives of that share in their database, saying, this is your account, this is what we owe you. That's really what they're saying, what we owe you. And they're essentially creating this means of showing that you have the right to own something through their traditional database systems. Where here we're just showing the exact same thing as a token on the blockchain. It's literally no different than a piece of paper or the data being in some database or being on the blockchain. It's just representing the right of the thing that you're trying to issue, sell, or engage with.
And I love that because a meathead like myself has been in the space for about 3 years, so I can follow what you're saying, put the pieces together and understand it. But I believe what you're saying, the platform that you're building is these people, that have a smartphone that sell rice don't really need to understand how all this happens in the background, but they could use your platform, get their rice on the blockchain, and, the unbankables just now in the system.
Absolutely. Really, all they need to understand is what I'm selling you is the right to this property. And when you buy it, it's now your property. And obviously, whatever legal jurisdiction you're in would essentially have to litigate on any sort of complexities on that. But the idea is, in the very simplest form, is selling you a representation of the right to the property that you're purchasing, and you can get a delivery of that property or essentially hold a derivative of that property in your possession, knowing full on well that it's yours. And like I said, there's a lot more complexity in that in terms of fees or what happens if there's a failure of delivery, which actually what I end up thinking is when it comes to blockchain networks, you may end up seeing a certain level of whether it's deposits or staking or whatever it may be in terms of being able to engage with people. So if there is a failure of delivery, you may see a slash, you may see a withdrawal of the deposit, whatever it may be, to allow for some level of insurance for the parties that are engaging with each other. But the biggest thing is at the end of the day, they're selling a right to a piece of property, and they're doing so in a digital format, not unlike how we traditionally see that with exchanges and different databases. We're just doing it on the blockchain now, which actually ends up being a lot easier for them, and actually ends up being a lot more automated because you don't necessarily need to deal with all these parties to engage with each other. So very much appreciate you coming up here, Mr. XRP. I'm going to bring up BlockFi. And like I said, if you have any other questions, I'll bring you up again. But yeah, I think those are really good questions, and I appreciate having you.